This whole thing started roughly 5.5, 6 years ago. At that time, the 9th Street Historic District, which is, I believe, the second historic district that was ever designated in Colorado, it had never had an archaeological assessment done. In other words, they'd done all kind of research into the homes that were preserved, but nobody had ever checked into what might potentially be below the surface. For a little background history, the entire 9th Street area, including the entire campus that area is built around, was condemned by Denver Urban Renewal Authority. And this process started in the 1960s and was completed in the early 70s when they bulldozed the entire campus, except for the 9th Street area. It was an older community. Some homes were deteriorating, but that's the situation everywhere where you have homes that are over 50 years old. And the largely Latino community that was displaced in 1970 wasn't the first displaced community. In 1858, when the miners showed up from Georgia, there was an encampment of about 100 teepees on the high ground at 9th Street Historic Park, and the high ground happens to be the same area that we're excavating in. Most archaeology of the past has been done by white archaeologists that decide we're going to excavate this area, and then they do it, and then it's over with, and there's no real communication with the people that you're excavating or any ongoing communication with the community afterwards as far as what happens to the artifacts. So before the project even formulated into deciding, hey, we're going to excavate and excavate here, we started out by asking these communities, what do you want?
When Gene came to me and asked if I wanted to help, I said, yeah, we should try this approach, community-based participatory research, which would be a way to get the community involved so they have a say, a claim to what is being decided with the knowledge that we are pulling from the ground. The very first thing that I did when me and Gene decided that we should go ahead and try to get funding for this project was I reached out to the Arapaho tribe. Very first person I called was from the Arapaho tribe. I said, someone came to me and we're looking at a site that is on stolen Arapaho land. How do you feel about that? And immediately they were like, oh, that's awesome. There's never been any archaeology done there. You know, like we're all about it, whatever we could do to help. And that kind of gave me what I felt was like the green light to go ahead and start exploring with other people and saying, hey, you know, the original stewards of this land are really keen on, you know, doing some kind of archaeology here. Who should we include? How can we include them? And what should we be looking for? And I think from there, everyone else jumping in, you know, the displaced Ararians, which is great. Because it's kind of two communities, displaced Ararians and the Arapaho. But don't get me wrong, there are some displaced Ararians who will tell you, hey, we are the Arapaho people, you know, we're Chicano, meaning like, you know, we're from Spanish descent, but we're also indigenous of the land. I think it's important to not look at it as two competing communities, but as a community of displaced people, which is the community that I'm talking about, not necessarily displaced Ararians, but the displaced Native Americans as well, that deserve to have a say in how we interpret their history. This whole project is based off of BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous people of color, and I think the state wanted to put emphasis back on those communities and projects that emphasize those communities. And so I thought, hey, this would be a great time to put my say in and show the direction I believe archaeology should be taking. And that's putting more emphasis on the communities that it's harmed in the past. I think that archaeology and anthropology as a whole has benefited colonialist white people and has done harm to those communities that it studies. And so I wanted to help transfer this whole idea of who we do our studies on and who it's for, and change the narrative to who is it by and who is it with. Especially in this country, it's always white people doing archaeology on Native Americans and interpreting it back to white people. And they limit the amount of say that Native Americans have in that knowledge. And then the amount of say that Native Americans do have in that knowledge, they call it something like myth or traditional indigenous knowledge instead of just what it is, and that's knowledge. There are different forms of knowledge, and I think that using community-based participatory research really incorporates all sorts of knowledge because it invites people from community members to archaeologists. Anyone who has a say really can have a say. and it encourages discourse around how we're going to interpret this data.
We have the story of a area, or you might have a story of anywhere, that's told usually from one side. And so it's very, very important, I think, with archaeology to involve as many people as possible. It's good for the students, it's good for training, it's good for the academic side, but there's also the human side. And what's nice about working here, of course, is that we have direct community involvement. There's a direct connection to people who are living here, people who can come and they say, well, I remember this or I remember that. And so that's always very, very important. So we help out students in many ways, but we also help out, I think, in this case, the displaced Aurarians, who I think have a very important story to tell and whose story really has been ignored. And so the archaeology adds to that story and re-emphasizes and highlights it right to people today.
Not only did we include the displaced Aurarians in the Latino community and the Native American community, but we also made a point of reaching out and including all 3 schools that are on this campus in our archaeological project. And to my knowledge, this is one of the first and rare opportunities that all 3 institutions on this campus have worked together. This is important because this is actually the reason why there's never been a memorial or a lasting museum or anything like that, because the 3 institutions are basically separate entities and have a real difficult time coming together and agreeing on anything. There is now a new scholarship for displaced Aurarians in perpetuity. In other words, anybody that's related to the displaced community can get free tuition at either of the 3 institutions, whether it's CCD, Metro State, or CU Denver. So ideally, this project will culminate in hopefully the establishment of a museum along with a one-stop shop for people, potential students that are interested in finding out if they qualify for the scholarships, where all of these things can be done at one place. And in a way, it's kind of a no-brainer. This is what this campus needs. So this project, we're hoping, has a life bigger than just the excavation and will accumulate in this further bonding of the present-day academic community and the displaced community. This has been a major point of contention on the Auraria campus for as long as I've been here, and actually it's been going on ever since 1970, is some kind of effort to acknowledge the displaced people. Everything that we're doing is designed one way or another to acknowledge those displaced communities. Just like there's no mention of the Latino community, there's definitely no mention of the indigenous communities that lived here. And this is not a good oversight at this point. What we're archaeologically going into is pretty much untouched ground. The areas that we're excavating and the features that we're excavating, for all practical purposes, have never had this kind of exploration done before. And at the very worst, they've only been impacted by water lines. We conducted an archaeological assessment, which was basically getting a ground-penetrating radar. And what that is actually a sled that was pulled across the ground surface, and it shoots radar signals into the ground and highlights any potential features or things of archaeological interest that might have been there. So we did that to approximately half of the historic district and came up with 6 or 7 different features that were of interest. One of the highlighted features, actually feature F, that we're digging at the site was thought to be a privy. And on the 9th Street Historic District, before they had running water or flush toilets, they had outhouses basically placed behind the houses, which is what a privy is. But as it's turning out, we are catching the rear end of the house that used to exist at 1040 9th Street. And the other one, which is feature E, was originally thought to be by the GPR crew to be a floor surface. From all appearances, what we found so far, feature E appears to be a cistern. which would be a water feature potentially to water horses. It's a completely round structure, about 5-6 feet in diameter. And apparently from what we found, that cistern was completely covered over and buried right around probably 1900, maybe as late as 1910. And then another building was put on top of that. There's no remains from the building that was put on top of it, but right now we're still in the process of excavating the cistern. Neither feature was what we thought they were going to be originally as projected by the GPR. They're both proving to be very interesting. And there was a couple of reasons why we thought these features, even though they weren't the ones that we originally wanted to excavate, would still be advantageous for historical purposes. A lot of these have to do with the identification of the neighborhood as being blighted, is the term that was used in the original report. Part of the rationale for condemning all of the Auraria campus was that it had been flooded, and the flood, from what we've seen from our excavation, never affected 9th Street. It only affected areas that were actually on the periphery of the Auraria campus. So the justification for the flood being a reason for the condemnation isn't held out by the evidence that we see. And also, it's kind of interesting because the artifacts that we've turned up so far, which have been fairly minimal, have all been some implements that definitely don't suggest poverty-stricken people. It seems like the whole 9th Street community was vibrant, not well-to-do, but definitely not poverty-stricken.
I think that whole narrative that it was a poor community, that it was almost deserving of being demolished is a lie. And I have kind of made it a personal kind of quest of mine to get to the bottom of that. I think a lot of the people who lived here would say, no, this was a great neighborhood. We didn't have money problems. We loved being outside. We felt safe. We felt at home. They would have a lot more to say than the whole narrative that's pushed about it that's told by other people.
There's a lot of ties of family members that lived around here. They used to all have a big dinner together, have parties, and everyone's door was open for everybody. So everyone knew who everyone was. Or even back here, my grandpa had friends, and he remember they always used to play in the back alleyway, kick the can, or they used to steal the pickles from the pickle factory that was here.
We were all really close-knit and involved with the church and the school. For me, I felt very safe and secure. So I took advantage of all that as far as taking shortcuts, feeling safe, knowing the neighborhood, knowing the people. Those years for me were just so special that I think I almost took it for granted, kind of special. The disbursement of our community was the most impactful. I mean, it just blew us apart as far as a community.
It was a bad loss. It was a horrible loss. We felt it to the bottom of our bones. I can imagine how the people who had to leave their homes had felt about it. And, through the years, nobody talked about where did the people go. Nobody was asking the questions about, well, just where did all those people that lived there go? We always ask that question, and everybody just had this blank look on their face, like probably the question hadn't been asked. Now, it's happening. People on this campus, the professors, a lot of the students in all 3 of the schools are very interested in knowing the history of what happened. But the pain and the trauma that these families suffered, I think it's unimaginable.
There's a word for it today, which is gentrification. And the largely white establishment in Denver in 1970 decided that the best place to place their ideal for this new university campus was in the poorest part of town, the people that had the least political voice. They were easy to remove. The selection of the community, the removal, were all deliberate and intentional. And today, even with the new I-70 project and the removal of those communities, it's kind of the same thing being repeated. Over and over again, it's the poorest communities, which in the Denver area happen to be certain ethnic groups that are continually targeted. The very least we can do is an acknowledgement of what's been done, and actually that's just the start. There were over 200 different families that were removed, more than 300 different homes and businesses that were bulldozed down. 9th Street Historic District is basically 14 buildings that were saved out of hundreds. The acknowledgement is the first step in undoing a harm that was done a long time ago to these communities. The best way to avoid further harms being done by these situations in the future is to know what harms were done by these situations in the past. And if you don't know your past, you can't really have a hope in fixing your future.